Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel and Escape from the City on the ABC. And Ben Kingsley, Chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of the 2018 Property Investment Advisory Firm of the Year.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch for each week. Ben and I bringing the insider's guide to property finance and money management. Hello, mate.
Hello, matey. Going?
Very, very good. Hey, I'm excited today. We get around the grounds. We've got Dr. Andrew Wilson joining us.
Brilliant.
Which is awesome. But before we do, a quick housekeeping. Congratulations on our book giveaway, Ben.
Yes.
To Wei Lee.
Wei Lee.
And Del Gillespie. They both won copies of that book, Ben. So, in our giveaway. But what we did is everyone else who contributed, although they didn't win that book, Ben, we're going to make sure they don't go away empty-handed. So they're going to get a copy of yours or mine book, yours or mine. In fact, it'll be both of ours. And what we're going to do is if they can just direct message us on Facebook, go and have a look.
Yep.
And they just let us know, I want the red one or the blue one. Whichever one they want, we'll give it to them. One's black and one's white, but I'm just going, I'm channeling my inner matrix.
You didn't want to go
channeling my inner matrix. No, I don't want to go, I didn't realise that's what I was doing. So there you go, folks. Reach out to us on Facebook, direct message. Let us know which one you want, and we'll give that to you. But, mate, before we go into our very special guest today,
I've got a special announcement too. Ooh. Did you know?
No, I did not know. Are we doing Did You Know early?
Well, I'll do this one early. That our Make Money Simple Again book, Bryce, has become a bestseller.
Yay! Thank you, folks, for helping us make it a bestseller. We are looking forward to that movement of people, Ben.
Yep, it's a crusade.
So my life hack, I'm going to go into our 7-day float as well, Ben.
Beautiful.
Another good tip for that. But you didn't tell me you were going to do that, mate, but I'm glad you did. A very exciting milestone for the Property Couch.
What's that?
We turned, what's that? You've got your stream already. We turned 4 this week. We turned 4. Who would have thought?
We're out of our dappies.
Well, very good point. So, Ben, who would have thought that people would be okay to tune into you and me banging on each week?
Yes.
So a big.
I've just used your blower.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry about that.
Not easily sort of translated across a podcast, but
maybe I need to find mine.
That helps. So we've incredibly humbled. We
Lost words.
Appreciate the opportunity from our community to support us enough that after 4 years we can still keep doing something that we absolutely love doing. So a shout out to both old and new listeners alike, but for those people who've been on the journey with us, Ben, and they do let us know.
Yep.
They've been with us since day one. Thank you. And for those new listeners, we certainly appreciate your what's the right word here, Ben? The
patronage.
That's
yeah, we appreciate that, and we also we'll keep working as hard as we can to keep bringing our insights, keep bringing the gold where we can find it, and our knowledge as much as we can expand on our insights. Hopefully they can. And
we're not resting on our laurels, Ben.
We've got
some exciting new things planned this year.
We do.
So so thanks for that. And hey, my mindset minute today is very, very simple. Myron Golden said this: the reason you need a job, Ben, is because your money is unemployed.
The reason you need a job is because your money is unemployed.
So if you get your money to work, you build whatever it is, and then you get a passive income, then your money is actually no longer unemployed. It's actually doing the job for you.
I like it. Interesting.
So the reason you need a job is your money is unemployed. So get your money to work, Ben. Get your money to work. But without any further ado, let's introduce our special guest today, Dr. Andrew Wilson, who is one of the leading independent economists around the country. Ben likes to have a lot of feedback around the property markets.
He does.
He is the chief economist at My Housing Market. Welcome to the couch, Andrew.
Thank you. Very good to be here, guys. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've had you on. It's good to have you back.
Yes, it's been a while. Don't be a stranger.
Hey, I thought it'd be a good chance to get you on because apparently the market's changed a bit over the last sort of little while compared to last time we had you on. So it'd be nice to get your insights and your view on the market. And in particular, what I like about your insights is you like to look under the bonnet and in terms of regions rather than just give a blanket statement about what Melbourne's doing or what Sydney's doing. So it'd be nice to talk to you. Probably let's kick it off with auction clearance rates and perhaps the Sydney market.
Well, look, of course it's been a very interesting 12 months in the market. It's sort of always interested in the housing market. It's very much a work in progress. But my call just briefly on it was we sort of had an easing of the market dynamic following a very strong period of growth in most centres through 2015 up until beginning of 2018. And look, as that interest rate driver lost its energy, which was always going to happen, the further away we went from interest rate cuts, the market did start to ease, prices growth started to ease, clearance rates have started to ease. And for my mind, it was a reasonably orderly process, although, we had these issues with APRA tightening or acting to tighten lending to investors, which I think was, certainly a problematic policy. Don't want to go too much into that. But,
Don't open that can of worms.
But look, it certainly was, the catalyst that got the market moving downwards, particularly when APRA had a second bite to that cherry in the middle of last year. And I think that it was reinforced by some remarkable negativity in the media. In late spring, really, it started. But look, up until October, the market was easing rather than falling. And from October, when we had a raft of doom and gloom headlines, I think that what we did see was the market sharply decline. And there's been a number of reasons put forward by commentators, which I don't agree with most of them, and that it was a process of a credit squeeze, and we certainly had a credit squeeze for investors, but that had been around for quite some time, and there's no doubt that what we did see was a bit of a good old-fashioned buyer strike, and that was buyers just decided that was it. This was getting a bit too scary. With the predictions of up to 40% price falls, why wouldn't you be scared?
No doubt.
It was it was just a never-ending narrative that was happening. Right.
Can you give the listeners an idea of what that looked like, Andrew? Because a lot of our listeners aren't in the Sydney marketplace, and clearly that's where you're exposed. But what sort of intensity was that? Were the headlines as you described?
Well, I think 60 Minutes was the key. Was the real flashpoint for the market, and there was a lot. My phone sort of rang off the hook the next day after the 60 Minutes show, which did predict 40% falls in house prices in 2019 this year, which was just an astonishing prediction to make, given we haven't, the worst we ever had in Sydney was 10% down peak to trough. So look, that I think was just the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of confidence. And I think a lot of buyers of course we had the Royal Commission happening at that time, and we always get a weakening in the market in terms of clearance rates at the back end of spring, because we get a lot more stock, and buyers tend to get satisfied earlier in the season. So it was just a perfect storm. And by the end of the year, it wasn't just Sydney, which was remarkable. It was really right across the country that we did see this negative mindset start to develop from buyers. And look, as I said, there's been a lot of analysis pointing towards a credit squeeze, but the Commonwealth Bank has clearly said that it was scratching its head as to what was happening in terms of being accused of tightening lending to owner-occupiers. Of course, investors have been doing it tougher for lending, but they said that what they experienced last year, towards the end of last year, was people just stopped walking through the door looking for loans.
That's what we saw on the ground, wasn't it?
Well, they were approving most loans. They're saying yes, it was taking a bit longer, but people just stopped walking through the door. And most of the other banks are in that. I spoke to the ANZ last week, and they said the same thing. That it was just people just became buyers, became skittish. They decided to sit on their hands and just wait and see. So it's a market that's been sort of driven on confidence downwards. But the thing that is remarkable really is that the underlying drivers of all our housing markets are very positive at the moment, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, and certainly some of the smaller markets, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Canberra, are still quite positive in terms of the underlying drivers. But it's very hard to shift confidence, but eventually it will shift. And I think that we've seen some early signs of that this year so far, which has surprised some of those doomsayers that we ended up last year with 40% clearance rates in Melbourne and Sydney, which were all-time lows, which was just remarkable. And we're now back looking at a much more balanced market, and a market that's starting to look a bit more interesting to buyers and to sellers, with clearance rates now pushing around 60% in Melbourne and Sydney.
So, Andrew, I want to come back to, I agree with you in terms of all of our buyers agents out in the field, talking with agents every day. They just said the buyers did dry up. I think everyone got a little bit fearful, the psychology, the confidence that you were talking about. I want to also, before we move into what we might be referring to as green shoots that we're seeing now.
Yes.
I mean, there's sort of famous lines that we hear after the post-GFC, right? But what I want to talk about is some of the data that we saw, Christmas sales data, retail sales, business confidence fell off a cliff. What do you read into those sorts of numbers? I mean, I've made a statement that I think it's a little bit of, when we lost our Prime Minister and I think that there's a lot of business confidence that took a hit, thinking, well, what do we look like under a Labor government? Whether that's going to dry up confidence in terms of employing people and so forth, just for the unknown, right? It's a big change and so forth. Give us your indications on what you're seeing in the macro economy, and where do you think, because some, as you're saying, population growth and all those things are positives. What about that story coming up to Christmas and what we saw from the Reserve Governor in terms of taking his position from a tightening position to a sort of steady as she goes position?
Well, look, you guys would probably know that for quite some time I clearly said that the next move in rates was more likely to be down than up. I've just been scratching my head as to these predictions of higher interest rates that we've had for the last year or so. It's not about the housing market, and I think the Reserve Bank got a little bit sidetracked with its focus on the housing market through the boom period. The clear issue that in our economy and most other established economies is that despite very low interest rates, we've failed to reinflate our macro economy. Income growth is just about as low as we've ever had it. The inflation target, we haven't met our inflation target, which was 2 to 3% for 3 years, annualised growth. It's a grinding environment out there, particularly in terms of consumption. As you mentioned, retail sales were very poor over December, but they've been struggling. And, these are the factors that eventually, if they didn't improve, which they haven't, would have meant the Reserve Bank would have had to switch to, creating some more stimulus, putting more money in people's pockets. And I think that's been one of the positives this year and last year, as you mentioned, the end of last year, is that the tone of the Reserve Bank has now changed from that, adamant prediction that the next move would be up. They're now saying, they went and said, well, maybe neutral. And now the market is clearly factoring in a rate cut sooner rather than later this year. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that, that other scare campaign that was running for a while, which was, interest rates were going to rise, I don't think is something that buyers need to fear. In fact, obviously lower interest rates are a positive, always improve a housing affordability. I'm not sure they'll do a lot, but they'll certainly act to moderate the negative mindset in a lot of buyers and sellers out there at the moment. And that's part of the gloom that's lifting. But look, these are big issues for Reserve Bank governors, for government banks, is what has happened to monetary policy. Why hasn't it worked? Because it hasn't worked. And, the punters out there are a little bit fed up with not seeing, more money in their pockets, despite us having, one of the strongest economies in terms of the labour market that we've ever had. But this is the same everywhere else. Unemployment is low, jobs are growing in the US, Eurozone, in UK, as well as here, of course, but people aren't making any extra money out of it. And the theory was always that when you had full employment or near it, you'd get competition for labour, which would push up wages, which would then work into inflation, and then we'd need to put up rates. But, I cannot see any circumstance in terms of economic activity where we would see higher interest rates. And look, that's a good thing, I think, for predictability going forward. But we've certainly had a big change over the last few months, and I don't think we'll get a cut next week. But I think we may be in for a cut in the April meeting of the Reserve Bank.
You make a good point, don't you, Andrew, that if we are seeing interest rates rising on the horizon, that people should be dancing in the streets, because it means that it's a reflection of a better economy.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and everybody gets it wrong like that. Yeah. But I don't think we're not going to get an interest rate rise You know, there's just no case for it. There hasn't been a case for it for 2 years, other than high house prices in Sydney. Yeah. And you can't, and it's, you know, that's the cart pulling the horse, because you know, housing markets shouldn't be leading you know, monetary policy. They're a response to monetary policy. But you know, we've got a lot of other negatives that have happened through this sort of a scare campaign, which has been a reduction in supply coming through. We're at the peak of the apartment boom right now in terms of supply on the ground. But in the next 2 years, we're going to see a significant falling away of new dwellings coming into the marketplace, and we're just going to be back to, you know, an undersupply in markets, given that we've still got strong population growth, particularly migration, and first home buyers are advantaged by lower prices as well as those stamp duty cuts. And you know, it's just been a quite a disturbing time in the marketplace, because, you know, I guess the narcs have, you know, sort of set the agenda, and we're now seeing, you know, the consequences of that, with, you know, prices lower than where they should be, and you know, the economy will suffer from a reduction in residential construction.
So Andrew, there's a couple of points there. I mean, we've educated our listeners on the wealth effect principles before. I was reading a piece from the ANZ research team at the end of last year about whether they thought the wealth effect had actually rippled through yet. I think they've changed their opinion now. But what's your view on the wealth effect theory and how it has changed consumption? Are you in the camp that obviously falling property prices make people a little bit more nervous?
Well, absolutely, and this is the other problem. You know, we've spoken about you know, the low wages growth. Now we've seen, you know, the principal asset for households, which is the family home, it's losing its value. So, you know, not only is your income flow declining, but you're also seeing your asset base decline as well. And this is something that's been sort of confected. It's not something that's happened, you know, in an orderly fashion, as it should have. It's happened because of interference from policymakers. And, you know, it's we've got near the lowest savings ratio we've ever had. And that's, I think, very concerning. And that does, and I think that's what's really concerned the Reserve Bank, is that people are, to survive, are now tapping into their savings. And the savings ratio is as low as it's been since 2007, and it was very low in 2007 for the completely opposite reason, because people were spending like drunken sailors then, because it was, you know, the boom to end all booms prior to the GFC. But now it's the reverse. It's you know, people are spending their savings to survive. That's why we do need interest rate cuts, and why we certainly need, and will get, I believe, significant tax cuts in the next budget.
So Andrew, there's a couple of things I want to talk about here in terms of, you know, we've been having an internal discussion in our investment committee meetings about who's going to pull what lever, because I'm definitely in the camp that I thought the next rate movement would be a cut if APRA was to maintain their positioning on their servicing calculation limits on the banks, right? So everyone's been talking about the speed limit on how quickly you can grow your investment book, and then the interest-only stuff. I think that's irrelevant. The only thing that's going to move the dial is whether APRA will actually move their assessment rates lower to allow the banks to lend more, right? Now, if they're not going to do that, and if APRA and the RBA have sort of behind closed doors worked out who's going to flinch first or who has to do the heavy lifting here, if APRA don't do it, then I do feel that the RBA is going to have to do something. Whereas if APRA do something, it may prolong the need for the RBA to actually trigger a cut if people are able to, you know, borrow what they would expect to be able to borrow, considering the real scrutiny that's now going on in terms of investigations around people's household spending. I think there is something in that, right? I mean, you know, we're now having to coach our borrowers to really be lean on their expenditure over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, because if there's abnormal spending in there, the banks are going to be harshly judged on that. Whereas the frustration from my end, you know, with wearing my mortgage broking hat, is that if I'm young and enjoying life with no commitments, I'm going to enjoy life. But once I know that I've got this massive debt, I'm going to change my spending habits. And that's what the vast majority of people do. But now, under this regulation and this more greater scrutiny, you've almost got to do it before you'll get the money, and that's another sort of, I suppose, barrier of entry for first home buyers and for anyone coming into this market.
Look, I was completely perplexed by the Banking Royal Commission. I think in terms of mortgage lending, it revealed nothing. And in fact, the recommendations were, to me, it was like trying to find a solution to a problem that didn't exist. And that's particularly in terms of mortgage broking. I'm not sure why mortgage brokers should have to carry the can for nothing, but they certainly have. Well, I mean, this is the problem. What was the problem? What was identified as the problem? Now, you mentioned the ratio determination, or the determination for income ratios for spending patterns. You know, the Royal Commission revealed, you know, startling news that, that it was because of the diversity of people's spending patterns that banks and financiers had used a model, right? And that, that model, however, was illogical because, yes, everybody spends at different rates in terms of their personal expenditure levels. Yeah, but okay, so that's, well, that makes sense, I guess, in terms of logic. Well, perhaps we should have a more rigorous model or a more rigorous reckoning of what people do spend on a weekly basis. But where's the problem? I mean, if we had a problem with that particular on the expenditure side in terms of spending to income ratios, it would have shown up in the mortgage defaults. It would have shown up in the arrears. And we still have the lowest mortgage defaults and very low mortgage arrear numbers right across the country. Exception slightly is Western Australia, but of course they've been doing it tough since the end of the mining boom. So, I mean, if this was a problem, it would have shown up with people being unable to pay their mortgages because they had, overstated or understated their expenditure levels. But, it was like a theoretical solution to a problem that, in my mind, that didn't exist. And similarly to, of course, the issues about commissions for mortgage brokers, that they shouldn't be loaded into mortgage repayments by customers. But, of course, where's the complaints from the customers?
It certainly wasn't customer-led, was it? There's no doubt. There was no doubt there was an agenda there. I mean, it's interesting. Scott Pape wrote an article on the weekend, aka the Barefoot Investor.
Yeah.
And, I couldn't agree with him more in terms of what he wrote in regards to when does the customer actually have to take responsibility for some of their actions, right? Now what he's referring to was last week we heard an announcement of a class action. I think it's Morrison Blackburn lawyers that take. I've got a lead case against Westpac about irresponsible lending to a couple who bought 5 investment properties. Now, my first instance on that is who goes and buys 5 investment properties and who helped them do that work, and what were they thinking, and where did they buy? And, was there any property investment advice given? Because if the bank is just lending, no typical household will just automatically say, we're going to go out and buy 5 properties, honey. I've read a book and now we need to go out and buy 5 properties, right? There's normally someone involved in that transaction. And I think the easiest way to fix this is to regulate property investment advice, because that's where, mortgage brokers moonlight as property investment advisors. And in some cases, in the very small circumstances, they do encourage people to do the wrong thing because it's self-interest, right? They're going to write a loan and get, but that's the rarity in terms of the norm. But we do have these people. If we have a professional industry for property investment advisors, then all of a sudden your mortgage broker can't necessarily say whether it's smart to invest in property and so forth. So that's an easy fix. But I also come back to your point around the mortgage books. We know the banks have been stress testing their mortgage books. We've heard from all manner of investigations. We know that the RBA are very, very clear, that APRA are very clear in terms of testing those books and in terms of how much advance payments people have. And there is no issue there. I mean, Governor Phillip has always said that there is absolutely no issue. The only big issue would be around unemployment. That would be a catalyst for a spike in delinquencies and mortgagee in possession. But there's no evidence of that just yet, is there, in terms of, a failing employment market where employment is what's holding us together. Yes, we're not getting the wage growth. Now, interestingly enough, I saw some data out of New South Wales that did show that New South Wales has had a reasonable amount of wage growth. Did you see that report in terms of something that came through around that the wage growth is actually starting to show signs in New South Wales? Given, I mean, what is it there at 3 point? Is it right? Am I right? 3.9 or something like that, unemployment rate?
Well, look, the latest wage index data that came out, certainly the wage growth levels are very low at the moment. But the interesting thing was that we've seen a slight uptick in the trend last year from basically all-time low growth levels, annualised growth levels. And it has been driven until the last data sets by the public service. And that's probably no surprise because they're not as, I guess, exposed to the type of bargaining patterns that the private sector have. Mm-hmm. But the last set of data did actually show, conversely, that the public sector growth rate had stopped, was level, but private sector wages had grown. Now it's still from it's still a very low level, the actual annualised growth rates, but it has been the first sign that the private sector is starting to grow. And look, that's a good thing, but it's coming from a long way back. This is the point, and it still needs a lot further to go to be able to stimulate the sort of consumption that the economy is missing out on. And that's why I believe that, and I think it's almost a given that we're going to get significant tax cuts in the budget coming up. It's an election budget, and I think that will assist, in
disposable income,
hopefully reinflating the economy. But look, just talk about that stress testing, which is almost laughable now. What's the stress level for interest rates that that the banks
7.25.
Can I tell you that as far as official rates are concerned, I've said to somebody the other day, we probably won't see an official interest rate with a 2 in front of it in our lifetimes going forward. Now, I hope to live a fair few years, but well, I mean it. I mean, we're heading now perhaps to a 1%, interest rate. There's no official rate. There's no prospect of interest rates increasing, in the next couple of years. The point that's moving against us now is international economy is starting to track backwards. We've got a lot of issues that are starting to confront difficult issues such as Brexit, the Trump tariffs, a lot of, problems that are coinciding with an easing in the business cycle, the international business cycle. So, we would need a lift internationally to help us, to get to the stage where we'd even be thinking of raising interest rates. And as I said, it's almost going to be, if those GDP numbers that come out in March next week are poor again, I think the Reserve Bank will almost be shouted down in terms of having to do a cut in April. They'd be keen to get ahead before the election. The Reserve Banks, even though they are, of course, apolitical, don't like to, if they can avoid it, make any moves during an election campaign because it seemed to be a partisan. And that, of course, happened during 2007 when John Howard lost, the Liberals lost through John Howard, and when interest rates were rising through that period. But so, as I said, I think that would happen. But look, I think we've got to re-examine a lot of things in our macroeconomic policy. We've got to stop, focusing on employment as being such a key driver. I mean, there's no doubt that the, inflation, wages and incomes and employment trifecta have broken away from each other in terms of being a relationship. I think the Reserve Bank has got to start targeting perhaps income growth as being one of the levers for monetary policy. And I think this is something that, other central banks are thinking about now, is the fact that incomes growth must, instead of being accepted as being an after product of high or low unemployment and high income and high jobs growth, it should be a starting point. That should be, incomes growth is the most important in terms of consumption, the most important element in an economy, and it's something that we're missing out really globally at the moment, despite everybody having a job.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, what's your message to property owners in this country for the next sort of 2 or 3 years then, despite the fact that they've got all this, particularly in New South Wales and Sydney, this negativity? What's your message to them, given that we, internationally, the fact that we've got more people wanting to move here, we do have low interest rates, we're politically stable, financially stable, got a great lifestyle. What's your message to property owners?
Well, look, I'm sort of, one of my little sayings is that you shouldn't regard economics as being a statue. And I think, in a sense, I know policymakers are up against it because they have to refer to the historical experience in terms of how they position, macroeconomic policy. But there's no doubt that things are changing. And what we're going to see going forward now is this period of very low interest rates, of low growth in terms of incomes growth, and low inflation. And I think that when I mean foreseeable future, I think we're talking years now. And it's this new environment that I think, particularly in Australia, is going to suit bricks and mortar investment. Now, it's going to be a different type of bricks and mortar investment, I guess, focus, because we're going to move away from that roller coaster ride of, trying to get in on the bottom and get out of the top type of scenario, which is not really, I guess, pure bricks and mortar investment as we really know it in our DNA. That's speculation. And I think that, the longer term view of property will become paramount because of a flight to bricks and mortar through this low growth, low inflation environment that we're going to have for the foreseeable future. We have enforced saving for housing in this country. We don't have to pay capital gains tax on the family home. We still have significant tax cuts, tax advantages if you're an investor, in terms of negative gearing, tax, capital gains tax relief, and tax depreciation. Now, let's see what happens if we get a new government in relation to that. But the point is that we're pointed in the direction of property investment in this country, whether as owner-occupiers or small-scale investors. There's no way known we're going to replace in any way what is such a significant proportion of our dwellings provided by the private industry in terms of rental accommodation. That has to stay. And as I said, I think that what we're going to see is more of a reflection of yield, chasing yield, although obviously yields are lower typically in residential investment, but they are still going to maintain a higher relationship compared to what underlying yield in the economy is if we've got official interest rates at around 1%. Yep. So, look, I do think the future is for bricks and mortar, and I'm not saying that in any terms of a vested interest. I've been saying that for quite some time now. This is in a way, this is the scary thing we had to have. This is the scare campaign that we had to have. And when we move through this, and the fog is starting to clear now, I think given that we're not going to have that roller coaster ride in terms of our business cycle and therefore our house price cycle going forward, people are going to be a lot more confident, a lot more with a much more predictable and certain house price cycle. I think that's a really good thing because it means builders, developers, governments, and those in the industry can have a lot more certain corporate structures going forward, and I think that's a really good thing. And I do think that our policymakers are going to learn the lesson, not to buy into the sort of hysterical narrative that's really been a product of our business cycle and housing market cycle for the last 30 years. So, look, that's my opinion. I do think it's, and it makes sense because, a flight to bricks and mortar is something, that is rational in an economy like ours where we have such significant, financial draw cards to bricks and mortar, but also cultural and social connections to it as well.
So, Andrew, I think whilst we're in this sort of policy frame headspace, I know our listeners, I'm obviously actively very much listening to every word you're saying right now.
Thank you.
And the next piece of that is obviously the negative gearing policy, because we've seen it now demonstrated that property prices are a product of demand and supply.
Yes.
And we see a policy that's out there, not necessarily the party, but the policy that we've got out there. What has been the industry feedback that you've got? And then secondly to that question is, what's your opinion of the policy?
Well, look, there's no doubt that it's whatever logical, foundation the negative gearing policy and reduction in the stamp duty, in the capital gains discount that the ALP are proposing, whatever, logical sense that policy had 2 years ago has certainly now moved at 180 degrees. I mean, at that time, and we can remember there was a raft of policies that were introduced because of very strong, particularly prices growth in Sydney. There were issues, whether this was sustainable. We had the lowest level as a proportion of the market of first home buyers in our history. We also had the highest level of investors in our history. So, this was all about, maintaining the great Australian dream. And this was also about what I guess another mechanism to reduce investor activity. But of course, now we have the complete opposite. We are now moving down to some of the lowest levels of investor activity in New South Wales, low in other states as well. Those states that didn't have high levels of investor activity have suffered, along with the states that did have, such as New South Wales, which is, illogical. But the other thing, of course, in terms of access to the market from first home buyers, we've had an absolute surge in first home buyers since the middle of 2017, when Victoria and New South Wales government introduced those significant discounts for stamp duty. We've seen, tens of thousands of extra first home buyers moving into the marketplace. And of course, we're seeing, downward movement of prices, which is again going to be good for first home buyers, together with, the forward prospects that interest rates will fall and not rise. So I'm not sure where the justification for the policy lies now. You could have mounted an argument, 2 years ago when we had high levels of investors, even though it was only basically in Sydney, and very low levels of first home buyers. But we have the reverse now. So why would you want to put, and of course at the end of the day, this policy is designed to reduce demand in the short term, which only means, as you said before, Ben, basic supply and demand. That will mean lower prices. Now we're already in this, environment of, who can come up with the most outrageous prediction for price falls this year. And we're going to have a new government potentially that's going to give the grist to the mill for those doomsayers, because it can only mean, after the policy introduced, reduced demand. That's what it's designed to do, which would mean more downward pressure on prices. Now, to me, I'm not sure how we can, the argument has been from the ALP because they're going to continue it with new housing. I think that, the premise that investors will shift from established to new is cloud cuckoo land stuff. Yep. Because, most investors want to see the product they're buying, in a sense. And, there's no new houses that are built in Sydney, more or less. And it's really an apartment play. And we know what's happening with the apartment market at the moment, which is at peak supply. So I'm not sure that's going to, in the short term, be a swap from established to new, which won't, in other words, offset a shakeout from investors, not having the capacity to get the tax advantages for established property purchases. And as I said, I think their policy horizon is such that they haven't announced that they will introduce it from day one. And I hope perhaps that some policy sense would prevail, and that they'll say, look, the market's changed. We need to wait and see how this is going to pan out. So we're going to hold off on this until it becomes a lot clearer that the market's sort of rebalancing, and maybe we're going to revisit the whole, the whole policy analysis to do with tax advantages for investors, particularly given that investors provide such a have such a key role in providing rental stock. And when we did see negative gearing change back in 86, we saw rents go through the roof and vacancy rates fall because of a shortage of rental accommodation. And it does depend on local market conditions as to that impact if they did get rid of negative gearing on a local basis. But it's certainly a lot of clear arguments why this would be a negative and not a positive, particularly in current conditions.
Andrew, do you see an opportunity for the ALP to back away from that prior to the election, or do you think that that would be something that they would still go to the election under that campaign and then do, as you said, after the election?
Well, look, as I said, it's you can't argue with it. This policy is designed to put downward pressure on prices. That's the clear aim of the policy, is to take a significant buyer group out of the market. and that means that those that were competing against that buyer group, investors such as first home buyers, would be able to pay less and get into the market. Now we already have this. We're down around 11% in Sydney over the year, and we're down around about 8% in Melbourne. The actual price declines are just starting to level off a little bit, which is some reasonable news, but still falling, but not at the same rate. So I don't think this is the environment. I think this is a test of leadership, to be quite honest. And I'm apolitical, but I think that the arguments are almost irresistible for a hold off on this policy, particularly compared to when it was introduced, where I still think that the negatives outweighed the positives in terms of the ALP policy. But I think now that the negatives are overwhelming, and I'm not sure, why there is this intransigence from the ALP. As I said, I think at some level this is a test of leadership.
It is interesting. We do know, Chris Bowen was on the 7:30 program before Christmas saying that they would give plenty of warning and let everyone know prior to the election. That positioning has changed in terms of they're now sort of saying we're not going to give any indication. So they're moving away from it. But as I said, I'm on record as saying, unfortunately, from a political point of view, given that the so-called revenue receipts that they were going to earn is going to pay for some of their election promises, it would be political suicide for them to now move away from that pre-election. But I hope,
that's right.
Hope post-election, if they are elected, that they start to see some common sense, and we're open for the debate. I mean, I'm putting my picker hat on now, Property Investors Council of Australia. I'm saying bring on that discussion. It's just the way the policy was frameworked was terrible. So there's definitely room for improvement. And there are some excesses in the system. So let's talk about what those excesses are, but let's not rob mum and dad from having an opportunity to buy a couple of investment properties to supplement their retirement income. I think that's just ludicrous.
Well, we should be, as I've been discussing today, that we should be talking about putting money in people's pockets, not taking it out of people's pockets. And that, of course, is what would happen with that policy through a number of probabilities, and one would possibly in tighter rental markets with fewer rental properties in the short term mean higher rents.
Yeah.
Obviously the investors who have to fork over are also income earners that would be earning less as well. Where's the money going to, I guess, where these tax receipts from the negative gearing policy, if it's introduced, they have to be reasonably targeted, but I would have thought also, given that we've had a significant reduction in the number of investors in the market, now that those tax receipts would be lower anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I had a conversation with a mate of mine who is in Queensland, and he has a project marketing business, and I sort of tongue-in-cheek said to him, you'd be sort of embracing these changes, and without taking a breath, he said, absolutely not. The short-term boom in demand. He goes, but all of a sudden, the people that are buying would just have no secondary market, right? So
they want a return on investment.
So even that side of the market is, unanimous. That,
the big developers have all come out and said it's not good policy, even though because they know that once everyone realises that there's no reasonable return for the investment outlay, even if there's a marginal yield return, people want to see a bit of capital growth, and that's what they expect. So that's true. Now I want to change the flavour back into, we're now in February. We've had 3, possibly 4. There has been 4 weekends of auctions. The first one I never count because that's just the warm up, right? That's where the guys, the agents are just coming off their break, and they're usually auctioning pretty ordinary properties. But last weekend we saw obviously our biggest weekend. So I'd love to get your, are we allowed to call it green shoots? Are we there yet, or what's your read on the market? And I want to do around the grounds in terms of what that looks like.
Well, look, it's certainly been a better news story rather than a good news story. And I think that's important because, it does start with green shoots, doesn't it? And they're definitely green shoots. And, when we're getting clearance rates 60% in Sydney, nearly 60, mid-50s, high 50s in Melbourne, compared to 40% at the end of last year. I think that's a positive. It shows that buyers are still there. Interestingly enough, Adelaide's doing quite well at the moment. It's had some 70% clearance rates. Canberra's a little bit off the boil because it had a very strong year last year. I think it's just settling. And Brisbane doesn't have a strongish auction market in terms of volumes. So its clearance rates really aren't a strong indication of what's happening in the marketplace. But look, it's a good start. I think the key things from the auction market this year, and this is for the general market anyway, is we've seen an improvement in clearance rates up to where they're, a sort of a balanced environment, buyer and seller around about mid-50s, high 60, mid-50s, high 50s. But we've seen and look, some are pointing to this, that there's been a significant drop-off in listings. In fact, listings in Sydney and Melbourne are down nearly 30% this year compared to the same time last year. And the same time last year, they were down 10% compared to the February 2017. So we've really seen, the buyer's strike turn into a seller's strike. And that's no surprise, because obviously sellers have more stake in this game, particularly when there's a lot of concern about finding a sale, what sort of price you're going to get, and whether there is a buyer out there in the first place. And I think that, this is obviously helping clearance rates where there's lower volumes being offered. So it does obviously mean more competition amongst buyers with a smaller pool of properties that are being offered. So that has to be said in the first instance. And that's, as I said, no surprise. But I do think that higher clearance rates will help to encourage sellers back into the market because they'll realise that, look, it's not as bad as it seemed. Now, that's the big picture, but there's been some very interesting regional results in Sydney and Melbourne as well. Sydney, in a suburban market, we're talking lower north, eastern suburbs, inner west, and the northern beaches, have had a very strong start to this year. Clearance rates up over 70%. Those parts of the market in Sydney actually skated through most of last year anyway, even during the doom and gloom period of the last 3 months of 2018. But those markets have been particularly strong this year, and auction numbers there haven't been too bad. The further out you go in Sydney, the tougher it gets to find a sale. Now in Melbourne, Melbourne's gone back to its very, very even market performance. All regions in Melbourne last weekend were above 50%. None of them were above 60%, but they're all tracking around about the mid-50s. So it was and look, there was nearly 1,000 auctions in Melbourne last weekend. But the other point to Melbourne is that some of the weaker parts of that market, such as the inner east, particularly the inner east, has looked like coming back this year, had some better results. They were a very tough market for sellers over the last year or so, particularly last year. So that's improved this year. So it's sort of the sense that, this can build momentum. And I'm not sort of talking it up in a sense. I mean, because the data is the data and it's inarguable. I had Sydney's median auction price, which I'm going to send out this week. Total auction price is down in February 2.5% compared to February last year. Now that's a year-on-year decline. But if we look at the I'll talk about the houses. Houses down 7.6%. If we looked at, that's February to February, but if we look at houses last December compared to December the year before, they were down 13.5%. So it just shows you that yes, house prices at auction are still falling in Sydney, but not at the same rate. And we shouldn't be surprised because clearance rates are improving to the point where it's not that falling off the cliff in terms of the market, and prices are falling sharply. But look, we've got a run up now till the pre-Easter Super Saturday. Numbers aren't going to be as high this year as they have been previously, but it'll be interesting to see if sellers are encouraged back into the marketplace. They'll be thinking about it now. We've still got a couple of months till Easter, and they'll start to think, well, look, maybe it's a good time to get into the market. Maybe it's a good time to think about buying, and working into that sort of trade-up energy where they can get a good deal on the higher price property as long as they can secure a sale on their property. And, of course, banks are still open for business. This has been a furphy about tightening lending conditions and, or a turning off the tap of lending. And as I said, I think that the markets moved forward, but these are baby steps to start with.
What's your view on some of the other sort of markets that don't suck up the headlines? In particular, sort of Hobart's done well of late,
yes.
and
yes.
also my old hometown of Perth. What's
yes.
the view there?
Well, I think in a sense, Perth's a pointer to the future. I think Perth obviously went through a significant boom, then a flattening due to extraordinary local economic conditions, the mining boom, the fly-in, fly-outs. It had to absorb, an extraordinary amount of vacant rental properties, which it has done to some degree. I mean, vacancy rates in Perth are now pushing down towards, who would believe, 2%. Coming back from what was nearly 5% at one stage. And I think that market is now finding its floor, but it lacks the lift-off that markets normally get from a drop in interest rates, because Perth was adjusting because of a significant macroeconomic event, while interest rates were falling and inflating eastern seaboard markets. So it's sort of got back to the bottom now, and I think that's where it is. It'll be a process now just based on, in a sense, pure demand and supply. A number of people coming in, number of houses being built. All the other factors are reasonably neutral. The economy is improved. Still got some work to do there. And, of course, interest rates are not going anywhere. And as I said, and the rental markets now look like it's started to balance out looks like a much more balanced market to that, very tough market it was for landlords over the past few years. So I think that points to, its energy was sucked out of it rather than eased out of it. And we're sort of getting that sucked out energy through negative sentiment in Melbourne and Sydney at the moment. But I think on the back of that, we'll start looking like the Perth market going forward.
Now, we talk about how the fewer properties that are being auctioned in Brisbane don't give us that indicator.
Yes.
Do you have a view on sort of some of the markets at southeast Queensland and then sort of some of the more regional areas? I mean, unfortunately, Townsville's been slapped with some floods and the whole wet area in the tropical North Queensland. But what's your view on sort of southeast Queensland pocket?
Well, look, steady market, the Brisbane market. Certainly now it's moved through that oversupply. I'm constantly talking about scare campaigns here, but there was, that was going to be the end of the world for the Brisbane market. Too many apartments, and their vacancy rates have tightened up quite sharply, particularly for apartments. Always going to happen. That was a good buy. I always thought of Queensland apartment, particularly near the river and the city, and tremendous value, high yields. But that market is a steady market. Again, it's sort of a little Perth-esque, if I could say that it's it just keeps on keeping on. People were sort of predicting a double-figure price growth, etc. in Brisbane, but markets don't really catch up. They need something to really help them move along, and interest rates are that key. And it's a steady market. Brisbane, a lot of people moving into Brisbane now. That's putting upward pressure on rents, keeping vacancy rates low and keeping yields quite reasonable. I think it's a good play, Brisbane, for those that are looking for a solid investment property with higher yields than Melbourne and Sydney. And but the regional markets, the Gold Coast, of course, was strong during the games period, but the infrastructure boom there has passed. It's now levelled off. Sunshine Coast has been quite a heady market after being a little bit of a sleeper for a while, but some of the higher coastal regions, higher priced coastal regions, such as north of Coolum, are doing quite well up to Noosa now. But there's a lot of gentrified money sort of moving into those areas, and retirement money keeps Caloundra ticking over as well. So that's again quite a solid market. Regional markets, Mackay was the first post-mining boom bust market to come out of the blocks, and it's been quite steady since then. Cairns has always been a reasonable performer, even through the tougher times that Far North Queensland and Central Queensland had through the end of the mining boom. But of course, as you mentioned, Townsville has done it tough all the way through, and it's been a real clear underperformer. And now they have the floods to deal with, which it never rains, it pours, if I could sort of say that. And it's been a market that's really got a long journey back to finding its finding some growth, and a lot to do, of course, with the local economy there, which suffered a lot of issues. And of course, the Townsville housing market suffered through those NRAS schemes, which really were a problem in the rental market there 3 or 4 years ago, and they're still trying to sort of recover from that with a lot of vacant properties. But some better news, areas such as Mackay, Bundaberg, and Cairns keeps on keeping on. So I think Queensland is now again reinforcing itself as a destination for Southerners. Has the highest net interstate migration, Queensland, of course, and affordability, lifestyle, climate, all those sort of bits and pieces, and the economy is doing quite reasonably. I think that higher unemployment in Brisbane lately has been a product of people moving in there, and I think that the fact that the building boom is over there, still some stock coming into the market, but there's going to be a significant shortage of apartments particularly in the city of Brisbane going forward, and that's something to keep an eye on.
Well, good feedback. I mean, around the grounds wouldn't be complete unless we have a quick chat about Darwin, and we didn't talk about Hobart.
Yes. Well, look, Darwin's, the apartment market in Darwin's been the real issue there. That's going to take quite some time to flatten out. There's really no sort of sign of that. Of course, there's no building happening in Darwin anymore. Prices have come back to a much more, I guess, in terms of houses, to a much more sort of rational, affordable environment, because we've seen the end of the mining boom. A lot of that Darwin market was exposed particularly to management groups during the boom, the mining boom, and that really did act to inflate available stock. Prices in Darwin were the highest in the country. Now they've come back to something a bit more rational. Again, it's a journey going forward, and it'll be helped by lower interest rates, but it's certainly got to. It'll take a while for it to clear what is a lot of excess apartment stock in the city there.
This is fantastic. So here's the question without notice then, Andrew.
Yeah.
Are we ready to go on record? Can I get your predictions for houses and units?
Yeah.
Now, loose predictions, ranges is fine.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's start with Darwin houses. Flat, growth, fall?
Well, I think that it's a flattish to higher market in Darwin, because it's really come through the toughest period, and that there's no real new stock coming into that market. There's a lot of investment, federal investment moving into Darwin. There's some issues with the local government, with the state government there, in terms of there's been some negative publicity there about some of its budget issues, but I still think it's flattish to marginally up. I think actually forecasting is once the gloomy negativity goes out of it, we're not going to see a lot of growth anywhere over 3 or 4%, maybe 5% in the capital cities, and that makes it sort of easy. We've just got to get through, just got to get a little bit of grit back into buyers and sellers, and I think that'll happen sooner rather than later. So yeah, Darwin flattish. And
that's units as well, or units a bit of pain?
No, units. I still think there's some downside to units.
Got it.
In units. Yep.
Okay, Perth houses.
Flat. Yeah.
Flat for 2019.
Yeah.
South Australia, Adelaide.
Well, I think Adelaide's the top performer in the country now, and I think there's a couple of percent at least in Adelaide. I said we're not going to talk anything silly here, like 5% to 10. But I do think again that Adelaide will be able to grow its median house price by a couple of percent. There's a couple of interesting things happening in Adelaide. Obviously, it's got a very tight rental market. Its yields are quite high, but there's a shift now in the migration pattern in Adelaide, and that is that I guess the drain that's always been a product of Adelaide, that is from locals moving to the eastern seaboard, is starting to ease. In fact, the trend is now clearly
they're coming home.
Yeah, well, they're staying. They're not leaving. And, of course, Adelaide's always taken advantage of the point system for migration, because you got an extra couple of points if you were prepared to live in Adelaide as a migrant. And but what that meant was, that's why it always had that that sort of flood over to the eastern seaboard, it meant that as soon as your time was up, because I think there's a 3-year horizon, you've got to stay there, everybody headed across to the east.
Yeah.
But that now looks to be, and look, migration is still holding up, and that point system encourages people to settle in Adelaide as a first port. But it is now starting to, that drain out of Adelaide to the eastern seaboard is now starting to ease, and I think that's a good thing because that means demand will obviously move into that market. And there's, it's a very steady, a remarkably affordable market, the Adelaide market, and it just keeps on keeping on. But it's certainly the best performer at the moment, and notwithstanding perhaps Hobart, which is sort of in catch-up mode and has been. But I'd certainly say there's some growth in Adelaide.
And so, in a word for units, flat or growth? Okay, units, beautiful. Yeah. Okay, let's go down to Melbourne. Houses.
Well, look, obviously these are tough asks, and it depends a lot on the mindset of the market. The whole point is that the underlying drivers in the Melbourne market are strong economy, strongest net migration in the country, strong first home buyer activity, low interest rates. The properties are still more affordable, significantly more affordable than Sydney, and the building cycle's peaked. There's a lot of stock coming into the market this year, but after that, there's just nothing at the back end. I think that we're seeing now the peak of the unit market, and I was surprised that we haven't seen more of a shakeout in that Melbourne unit. But it is a tough ask at the moment for agents selling units in Melbourne. But once again, once the peak supply point is reached, which is now, you're going to sort of move back, particularly given that very strong net migration. But I think that if we're tracking at about, I think clearly the rate of decline for Melbourne house prices and unit prices will ease significantly this year. Yep. I think that given it's coming from a low base, I don't think that prices at the end of this year in Melbourne will be more than a couple of % lower than where they started the year.
Okay, that's a good tip. In terms of, let's get down to Hobart.
Well, look, Hobart's gone through a great period of growth. The median house price in Hobart now is approaching that of Adelaide, which you wouldn't believe. But I think all good things come to an end, and that's about affordability, and it's about the income capacity of those in Hobart. But look at great yields, tightest rental market in the country. I guess you would suggest, and I said Adelaide was the best performer. You have to say that Hobart, and that'll be the mainland capitals, that Hobart still has a lot of upside to it in terms of some growth, and it would logically be the top performer with maybe about 5% growth this year. And of course, there's not a lot of units that get sold in Hobart.
Yeah, it's non-existent. Let's go around to our nation's capital, Canberra.
Well, look, Canberra certainly was a star performer at the back end of the boom, the Sydney and Melbourne boom. It's run out of puff as it was going to happen, but it started late, and that was because of all that fiscal consolidation budget cuts that happened through the Gillard and then the Abbott governments, if we remember them. And that sort of kept the lid on house price growth in Canberra during the early part of the Sydney boom. But it's come back, strong migration, a lot of money being invested in Canberra by both the local and, of course, the national governments. Look, there's probably, it's past its peak in terms of growth, but probably a couple of % in Canberra, I believe, there. But I think the special in Canberra is always units, very strong yield, and of course very low vacancy rates. And I think that yields have probably got prices have probably got a couple of % in Canberra for units.
Beautiful. Okay, now we're heading up the eastern seaboard. Let's get into Sydney houses.
Well, I think a similar thing to Melbourne. I think that I think Sydney units will be down perhaps 5% this year.
Okay.
But I do think that Sydney houses will only be down a couple of % this year.
Yep.
So I do think that's we're going to move through the sort of the strong growth phase. I cannot see peak to trough in Sydney more than certainly not more than 20% And I think that's fanciful, that there'd be more than a 20% peak to trough decline in prices in Sydney and similarly in Melbourne. But this year, I think a decline of 2 or 3%, something like that.
Yeah, and look, what's interesting in what you're saying. I mean, you were talking about some of those inner city areas of Sydney.
Yeah,
what we have seen,
very well.
Yeah, what we've seen in Perth is they've actually had some small growth in, you know, their more blue chip areas of Perth.
Yeah, like Claremont and
correct.
Those areas, I think, are special. You know, it's. I mean, they're iconic areas. You know, and you know, particularly in that sort of Claremont area.
And that's the ripple effect taking shape. So
that's right.
We do know the same sort of thing. So when we talk about, like what you're saying, Melbourne being down 2 and Sydney potentially being down 2 and maybe down 5 for apartments, there's going to be some pockets of opportunity there and some pockets of growth.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? This is headlines rather than the markets within the market. So,
and look, I've been saying to my presentations this year, I've been saying, look, that you know, you've got to start forgetting about the market. This is the point going forward, that it's not going to be about the market, it's about the property. And people are going to be educated to thinking, like, if I'm thinking about the market, I'm going to miss out on the property. And, you know, all properties are different. Now, you know, there are situations where if you think you're going to get it cheaper next week or next month, you'll probably miss out. And that's that value perception that buyers all of a sudden will start thinking, hello, this looks like it's sold now and I missed out, so I'm a bit more motivated when it comes to the next property because I don't want to miss out. And then that creates that momentum you were talking about. And, of course, I'll tell you something that we are seeing also in Sydney, and I think also we're seeing this in Melbourne, is that buyers are moving into areas that they probably couldn't have afforded before. I'm talking about inner west in Sydney and the inner east in Melbourne. And that's why we're seeing some increased activity in those areas, because buyers that were priced out of those areas, and they are obviously prestige areas, are now finding that they can afford their way back into there or into those areas. And that, again, is that value perception, which starts to build momentum. And as I said, I think that, you know, we'll be, you know, given, I think the big risks going forward will be the federal election and the negative gearing policy. It'll just create more doubt in the mindset of the market. But if we can get that over and done with by winter, have the normal winter break hiatus, I think the market will come back with a much more positive mindset if we have a decent autumn season. And the autumn season has started off as well as I would suggest you could have expected. You know, it's better. Numbers are down. But, you know, imagine if we had 40% clearance rates to start the year this year. Well, it would have been on. It would have been on for young and old. Well, I mean, we would have had, you know, cataclysmic housing market crash headlines all around the place.
The RBA would have had to pull the trigger straight away.
They would have.
Bang, bang. They would have pulled the trigger. They could have even gone down to 0.5 in a cash rate, right? So we know that there's still some levers to pull. We'll just finish off with Brisbane because there's probably some Queensland, Brisbane listeners here.
So steady as she goes, Brisbane. I think there's a couple of percent in Brisbane on the back of strong migration, on the back of affordability, and you know, the good areas again are in the suburban areas. Out to the north has always had some good value in Brisbane. Not the far north. I'm talking out to sort of Aspley area, a little further out perhaps, but it's still a bit tough in areas such as Caboolture, Narangba, these sort of areas. But look, Brisbane's, you know, a remarkable value market, and you know, a market now that has its own, I guess, inner city high-rise, you know, market as well, and which is doing quite reasonably in most of those pockets, particularly the ones that are close to the river, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really good stuff. I mean, the podcast has gone for a little bit longer than we normally do, but I think it's important. I think it's important because it's starting the year, giving us some insights.
Yes.
And I think you know, not only did we get some insights from you around the markets, but we've tapped into your credentials as an economist so that we could lift our eyes, go up 30,000 feet, and have a look at the country. So we certainly appreciate you coming on. And
it's my pleasure, guys. I really appreciate it. Anything I can do to provide you with any of the data or any insights, I'm always happy to help, of course.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, the data is the data is the data, and as we were saying before, you only know when it's the bottom after you see the bottom. You know, you know, no one can ever predict the bottom, can they?
Well, I'm a great believer in data, but data is only the first part of the exercise. You've got to turn that data into information, then you've got to turn that information into knowledge, and then that transfers into intelligence, and then with a bit of luck you've got some wisdom to be able to offer people, and that's the key thing, is just to have some wisdom about you, but it all starts with data.
Yeah, well, it's not the information age anymore, it's the insights age, and you provide those insights, which we appreciate, and I think all the Property Couch listeners would appreciate it too. But mate,
thanks, guys.
We appreciate it. We'll have you on again, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Andrew.
Beautiful. Thank you.
All right, Ben. So it's always a treat to chat to Andrew. He's always got a lot to say.
He has plenty of knowledge to pass on.
And the thing is that he's always insightful, on the spot. There was no prep with that. Just said, let's have a chat. And we didn't even know where we were going to go. And I think it's fair to say that we covered a fair bit of ground. So
I think that a couple of big takeaways from me. First of all, he predicted a rate cut in April.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting. We've got a few predictions there in terms of the overall markets, but my takeaway from that, remember, always markets within markets. We covered off on wealth effect, all of the different things, the confidence psychology. But I think he's a little bit, he's a bit more bullish than bearish is probably the way I would call it. And even though, some markets are still going to fall, the falls are going to be a little bit softer than...
Good point, Ben. We did go around the grounds. I think it's important for us to remind our community that we talked at the headline level there.
Yep.
So we always encourage our community to dive into the numbers, have a look at isolated pockets, have a look at houses within streets.
He said you're always buying a property, remember? You're not buying the market, you're buying a property. That was a great little takeaway for me there.
Exactly. No one's buying Sydney, Ben.
No one.
No one's buying Melbourne.
Well, let me know if you've got enough cash to buy Sydney.
Yep. I'd like to know that. So I think you'd have to merge a few people. So it's been my life hack today is continuation from my agenda to try and get people indoctrinated into the 7-day float, because we think it transforms their money management. So today, my life hack around another reason why you would have a 7-day float, Ben, is it teaches you the difference between conscious and unconscious spending. So what does that actually mean? How many of you could say that you drove to the office today, or you drove somewhere, or you're running and you just didn't think about it, you just got there because it was just unconscious? The same thing happens for your spending, where you just get up, tap, 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 then all of a sudden you go, wow, I ran out of money, then I've got to just get from the well and then get to the end of the month and have a look back. When you have a 7-day float, Ben, you no longer can get away with unconscious spending, because two things happen. One, you're consciously making it last, or two, you run out of cash and you know about it, because if you follow the system, you go, it's Tuesday, I've got no money left, 2 days left. So you either make it last for the next 2 days, or you go back to the well, Ben, consciously, and top it up. So the reason I want you to get a 7-day float, the life hack around this is because it encourages you to learn the difference. Well, make sure that you don't have unconscious spending anymore. It's all conscious spending, Ben.
Look, we've talked about this before in other episodes and also in other sort of platforms where we're educating. So it's just a nice, timely reminder, Bryce. I love it. It's really simple. If I'm going to do it, I've got two choices. That ultimately comes off my surplus, and I've made that conscious decision, or I'm going to have to effectively re-resource it and pay it back so I can trap that surplus and make some sacrifice with my other spending inside that 12 months. So I love it.
My Mindset Minute was about making sure that your work is employed, not unemployed. That's very much into it, Ben. Make sure that you've employed it properly.
Yep. Every dollar has a job to do.
Like it. Did you know?
Did you know, Bryce? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, sell or hold. We have been very surprised with the number of people who are organising a free account. So part of us is like, well, that's exciting, but it's also a little bit disappointing, right? Because it means that they've got properties that are burning their guts in terms of they're going to have to make a decision on whether to sell or hold. So that's why we build it. That's why it's there, because of opportunity cost. We want your money working harder for you. So yeah, for those people who have that decision to make, it is by far the very best place to go and find that information. And I've got a did you know that circles back into that. But
what can I say? Because I don't know what your did you know is, so I might be...
No, we've got a couple of little fun facts.
Overlapping here. But the fact... Making the invisible visible is very good, because if you just go into the free account, it actually gives you full visibility on what is the entry, the during and the recycle costs, and it just creates an increased awareness. So at the very least, Ben...
You're getting value in the free account, so we know that, and then once you open up the whole seller hold area of the platform, it's mind-blowing in terms of some of the insights you're going to get. So, and Bryce, just remember the 20% discount for all of our podcast listeners, TPC, capital letters 20, will get you $99 off your reports and accessing the seller hold area of the platform. So now there's only 3 weeks to go. That's our launch offer. So if you're looking to scratch that itch and get that visibility on a property that you're not quite sure about, now's the time to act. But those people who are doing that, it obviously means they've got to scratch that itch. They've got to work out what they need to do. Because one of my funny little did you knows was, if you're banging your head against the wall, Bryce,
I'll be the judge of that.
You burn 150 calories an hour.
Oh.
So, for those people who are banging their heads against the wall,
yeah,
you're burning 150 calories an hour. That's a little fun fact.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're not doing that once you do your seller hold and you exercise your demons.
Welcome to the
coconut water.
Collingwood sense of humour, folks.
Coconut water. Collingwood supporters have been banging their head against the wall for a very long time. Very frustrated sometimes, but excited about the year ahead. We won't talk footy just yet. Coconut water can be used as blood plasma. Did you know that? Did you know that?
I didn't know that. I drink a lot of coconut water.
You breathe on average 8,409,600 times a year.
Right. Didn't know that either.
And the last one, just circling back to my little fact last week about plane flights.
Oh, yeah, that was
Did you
intriguing.
know, at this moment, right now, Bryce, over 60,000 people are on aircrafts across America.
Oh.
Right now. 60,000 people are in the sky.
It's a lot of people.
That's a big town.
Can relate
That's
to
bigger
that.
than some of our towns here in Australia are in the sky.
Yeah.
So there you go.
And statistically, they're safer up there than they are down here.
Pretty much. Well, in America, that's probably true.
Wow. So there you go, folks. If you didn't know that, like me, I didn't know any of those. So I appreciate the insights that you provide each week, Ben, on your Did You Know segment, mate. Until next week.
Bryce, knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
Well said. See you next week, folks. Folks, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Just a quick reminder that this is general advice only, and you should always consult a professional advisor before making any investment decisions. And if you haven't had the chance to go back to the foundational episodes, we've got good news for you. Go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and check out the free binge guide, which gives you the insights you need from the first 20 episodes, where we unpack the foundational pillars of the Insider's Guide to Property, Finance and Money Management. It's completely free and available now.